You can't have the story of 1984 without the destruction of history. You need to destroy and control history because history tells us why things are the way they are. It explains things. Well, why do we use money? Or why do we have a government? Why do we drive cars? Some historian can come on and explain to you, well, here's the history of the car. Here's the history of money. Here's the history of government. Oh, yeah, well, that makes sense. I understand why things are the way we are. And if you just manipulate that history, you can make sure nobody questions anything and says, because if the history is different than the presentation, then people might say, well, if we were really advanced in the past, why are we living this crappy reality? So the control of history is really important in order to make the present the way the people running the show want it to be.
So if I can give a brief a summary. So there's some large event, undetermined large event in the mid 1800s. It decimates a population, possibly all over the world. After which this World's Fair is constructed to create a new history, which is a foundation for all the young people to remember and attach themselves to, so they can go on living with this new created history for them to then use as their building blocks to continue on living. And that's what we have thus far. And there are discrepancies with what you're finding if you go back maybe 1,000 years or 500 years versus which we commonly are taught in school today. So there is some sort of manipulation going on. And is it real? Like when it comes to this fictitious history that's presented at these world fairs, are you saying like the World Fair itself is fictitious? Like how the hell can they construct all this stuff? Or are we saying that that itself is kind of manipulated? Like, I guess I'm having a tough time wrapping my head around that.
We have photographs of these World's Fairs, and the photographs are, the buildings are huge. The site is huge. We have the photographs aren't going to lie. So we know we had the event. So I'm not disputing that the St. Louis World's Fair or the San Francisco World's Fair or the Buffalo World's Fair, they happened. They existed. they were there. The buildings were there. The question becomes twofold: is one, where did the buildings come from? How did they actually get this constructed? And then two, why were they really building it? What was the real reason for wanting to put this amount of material, manpower, money? Because every World's Fair, this is a bizarre thing, they all lost money. They were financed by I guess what you call the robber barons of the time, right? They were the billionaires of their era. They're the ones who funded them. And they all lost money. The first big one in the US was in Philadelphia in 1876, and it lost like $4 million, which is a massive amount of money. Now, one thing about rich people, one of the reasons they get rich and stay rich is because they don't lose money. They don't get into ventures where they lose money. But these events, no, we're losing tons of money. Let's keep doing them. So it's another thing right away that's telling you then the money means nothing. So if we get to the buildings, okay, so the buildings became, when I was still in the early stage, Joe was asking about how I researched this and how I would start doing this. Well, I've been studying this for about a month, and I was kind of like, well, I don't really know. I mean, I've built a fence. I don't know about building a building, right? So I went to see some building contractors that I know, people who build large construction projects every day of their life. And I took them photos of the Chicago Exposition, and they were like, what the hell is this? And I explained to them, well, this is the Chicago Exposition of 1893. And he's just looking at the photographs. And I said, could you build this for me today? It's the whole thing. Yeah. You've got unlimited budget, unlimited manpower. Could you build this for me today? He goes, yeah, of course, I can build this for you. How long will it take it? He says, well, it's going to take me 2 years for the planning because, you've got really detailed problems just with the layout. You've got all of this waterworks, lagoons, lakes. They were built on a swamp, so you had to handle things with the swamp. He said, I need 2 years for the planning. Then I need 2 years for all this landscaping to get the surface area the way we need it to be in the water situation correct. Then give me, depending on the materials and the guy, give me 10 to 12 years, and I can get the buildings up for you. And so I said about 15 to 16 years with modern machines. Yeah, give or take. So I reminded, well, this is supposed to have taken 2 years total from the time they first had the first planning meeting to the time they had the thing running in Chicago when they couldn't couldn't construct in the wintertime because it's minus 300 degrees. And his only response was, it's not possible.
So at this point, either they did the impossible, or that these world fairs were generated in some way very quickly.
Right. You've got two. Okay, you've got like 20 possibilities. If you begin to say they couldn't have built this real, in 2 years in this time frame with what they have now. The reason the historical record claims that they have done this in 2 years is because they built with a building material known as staff, right, which is a plaster and wood overlay, that they built really cheap, crappy buildings. And I'm sure they did. I'm sure they built a lot of buildings like that. But if you look at the Buffalo Electric Tower, which was 325 feet high and had a number of elevators in the interior that would take people to the top to look out over the Buffalo Exposition, are you going to build that out of wood and paper? Like, and you just see so many of the buildings, you could go to the top of them and have walkways and sit on the top, and you can't build these structures the way they've been told. So that means the historical record of how they're being built is wrong. So it opens up the doorway. Well, there has to be some other explanation then.
Well, I would imagine also Buffalo and Chicago, they're by the lake, so you get the lake effect, and they're both very windy places. And if you have like a plaster and wood structure 300 feet in the air, that thing's going to tip over like balsa wood.
Exactly.
And then there's the other factor that, from what and I'd be curious to hear your take on this, but the Devil in the White City, from what I remember reading in that book, was the World's Fair it actually became instrumental in helping solve the problem of working vertically in the structural sense. But as you're describing, is that the World's Fair was kind of doing this like it was no big deal. But I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
The challenge again becomes like, okay, you've got two possible answers for this. Either one, they really did build this in 2 years. Okay, if that's true, then it means they had to have a technology they're not supposed to have, because you can't build these with the equipment that you're supposed to have on hand in that time frame. It's just, any building contractor will tell you that it's impossible. I know lots of people will watch the show, old world craftsmanship, and people took more care in what they did, and they were better builders in those days. Yeah, but you need to actually be on a building site for years and years and get that person's perspective on how you build 40 massive structures in 2 years plus everything else. So the other option then becomes, okay, if they didn't build it in 2 years, it either means A, they built it over 50 years or 100 years and the historical record is wrong, or maybe they didn't build much of it at all. Maybe the buildings were there already and they just needed to be cleaned up, repainted, because that's one of the things these fairs all did, is they painted the structures very carefully. And if you get an old structure and a brand new one painted exactly the same, you're going to have a really hard time telling which one is which. And I'm leaning to that theory, but there's lots of them. I mean, like you can go pretty wild. Like they built them in a parallel reality and then manipulated them into this reality. They had 3D printing technology, because if you could 3D print pieces of the wall, then you could put the things up pretty quickly if you were 3D printing it right on site. There's 50 theories. I've just managed to, I think with the book, been able to tear apart the standard narrative to be able to say the standard narrative is 99% probably wrong. But I don't have a time machine. I didn't go back in time and film it and be able to know what did happen. So I can't give an answer. And anyone who tries to say they have the answer and they know for sure, they're not being honest with you. The honest answer is what we can do with any historical event, whether it's how the pyramids are supposed to be built, or what's going on at Stonehenge, or what's happening in Peru, or any of these buildings, is that this is what history presents to us. This is the story. Does the story logically hold up? Can you, in a sense, scientifically and really well dig through that story and prove it's true? Most of the time you can't. So then, okay, we can tear out the narrative, we can tear out the standard story, but we're left with this void of, but we don't really know what's there. We can only get little pieces, little pieces, and we just hope that enough people get enough pieces. If you put it together, you might figure it out.
Also, very interesting, like during this time period, you have in the early 1900s, the building of Coral Castle down in southern Florida. And
1950s.
is that 1950s?
It's after the war.
It's quoted that this guy said, "I've discovered the secrets of the pyramids and found out how the Egyptians and the ancient builders in Peru managed to do everything they did." And he was moving tons of rocks around for Coral Castle. They still don't know exactly what he did.
No, Coral Castle, Edwin Leedscalen, right? Really interesting guy if no one's ever bumped into him. And yeah, he built this little personal park out of massive stones. And there's really weird stories of people who knew him or who were around him, or the stone would show up on a truck and then he'd send the guy for coffee, and then the stone would be up in his land somewhere. And the guy's like, "How the hell did you do this?" But what's more weird that most people don't know is he wrote a couple of books, and the books, they're for free on the internet. You can actually just go read them on the internet. They are the weirdest books imaginable. And at first I was reading them, and it was like giving you how to make your coffee, and what kind of chairs are good to sit on, and if you the why one direction is better than another. It was just, and I started realizing it's code. He's writing in code. He's writing like some sort of weird symbolic. And as you started breaking some of the code, you began to see that he's telling you what he did in these books, even though it looks like I figured this out because I had a conversation like this with the Zen monk that I spent a year with from Korea. And one day he came out of his room. He usually never talked to us, but he sat down with me at the table, and he started telling me some stories about like Chinese food, and this women in France, and changing tires on a car, and some guy's hip that he knew. And then he got up and he left the table and went back to his room. And the guy I was sitting with beside me said, did you get all that? Like, what do you mean? He just told you your entire life story. He told you everything about you. And I realized, what? He's not telling you about food and cars, and he's telling you about you. And if you go back and understand what he just told you symbolically, you would know everything about your life. And I think Leedscalen was doing something similar. He was presenting it all in these books of what he did, but so symbolically and so hidden that the average person would just totally miss it. They would just think this is garbage. And so yeah, Leedscalen, highly recommend people dig into that, especially if you're in Florida. Go check it out.
I think that's super interesting. And one of the things that I was interested in asking you about, listening to the appearance you had on Sam Tripoli's show, was the Easter Island thing, because I don't understand a ton about it, but I do, from what I've been able to tell, is, again, I don't even know if Easter Island exists because I've never been there. And so this idea of narrative structuring and what we know and what we don't know is so super interesting. But from what I understand, these statues, it's not what's above the ground, it's what's below the ground, which demonstrates the size. And then how did people even get there to begin with, and the knowledge of seafaring from the Polynesians and everything. This is one of the most remote places on Earth. What can you tell us about Easter Island? I know that's maybe not that connected to the World's Fair, but do you have thoughts on that?
It's all connected to the World's Fair in a sense, because it's all history and what we believe, like you say, about the story. And I've never been to Easter Island either. I've been to a lot of places, but I've never been to Easter Island. But I'm going to assume it's there. I'm going to assume it exists. The pictures seem quite real, quite truthful. And what you've got there, first of all, are three different things to think about with Easter Island. The first is that the oldest moai, the oldest statues, are, like you say, are mostly buried in the ground. So the head you see on top is like 2/3 of it is below ground. And it's built out of the hardest material, the hardest stone. Then there's another set of moai that obviously come from a much more recent period, that are shorter, don't go into the ground, and are built out of a very simple, a much softer stone. So obviously somebody later on was mimicking the huge moai that they had seen before, but didn't have the knowledge of how to work with that kind of stone. You see this with the ancient Egypt so much, where you see you see this pre-Old Kingdom Egypt, what they were doing with the stone. The Old Kingdom Egypt was trying to copy it as best they could, and it's still good, but not like the other stuff. And then the Middle and New Kingdom Egypt were again trying to copy what was before. So you have this copying, first of all, in Easter Island. So who were the two sets of groups that were doing the moai in the first place? Never mind why they're building them, how are they doing it? Then the third thing is this, what most people don't know too much about, is this thing called the Rongorongo text or Rongorongo language, which is like a written hieroglyphic language that appears only in Easter Island. And there are some texts, and as I know, there's supposedly nobody that can read it. It's kind of like the Voynich manuscript, right? It's like, it's this really strange, symbolic language. But what has come through, at least of the legends and the stories, there are many legends and stories passed down through Easter Island that's very similar to ancient Egyptian. That when you take the and I can't think of the top of my head, I have to pull out some books, but there are certain legends told on Easter Island about a birdman and flying off one of the mountains and jumping into the water. It's all the story of Horus. If you know the Egyptian mythology, you can unravel the stuff on Easter Island. So you begin to see this connection. It's one of the reasons that I wrote my first book way back when, Power of Then, was this idea that if you can understand the ancient symbolism, the ancient alchemic and presentation, then you can take apart any ancient site, any religious text, any fairy tale, anything where there's wisdom presented in it. The symbols will never change. The symbolic language will stay the same. Once you know the symbolic language, you can unravel what's being presented. So it's similar to Easter Island. If you can find and understand enough symbols, you'll start to get what was going on there.
That's incredible.
When I was listening to your talk, and I have your books ordered, and they're coming. I'll probably dig through them here in the next few weeks. But I was curious, like when we touched on like the fact that when you brought up briefly about a simulated reality and how that might apply to like a topic like the Mandela effect, which is coming to prominence over the past 15 years on the internet, where people remember Nelson Mandela dying in the prison. Then there's a whole bunch of other people like, no, he's alive. There's a discrepancy in our memory as a civilization. And I'm sure as you remember things or learn things, the further back you go, there's a difference of what people remember. Is the Mandela effect applicable to what you discovered about the World's Fair and our history and the nature of reality? Like, how do you view our reality and how we remember history?
Okay, let's just start with, Joe just left, but I'll ask all three of you. Let's just ask the same question, just out of curiosity. So question one, do you believe we're in a simulated reality? Yes or no? Do you believe the Mandela effect is real? Yes or no? Let's just see the three of you. Let's see what your answers are. So
I will answer. I have a complex justification, but in an effort to keep this simple, simulated reality, yes. Mandela effect, I would say probably yes.
Okay, James.
So I'm gonna play skeptic and say no on both of those. I think Mandela effect is primarily just people misremembering or not paying attention.
Okay, Joe.
Yeah. I love the idea of that stuff, but I tend to think that it's somewhat nihilistic to think that it's a simulated reality, because to some extent it's like this is all we've got, so it's the only reality we have. But again, it's like I'm only being fed what I see, is just as like everybody else.
And Mandela effect, what would you be for yes or no on that?
That's a phenomenon I don't understand, because the Berenstain Bears one it caught me completely off guard. So yeah, I'm just fascinated by that. It's almost like deja vu. It's like it's this thing that it's like I don't know what to say, because some people it is like it's genuine. The Mandela thing, especially.
I think the reason I asked that is because the three of you are into alternative topics and various things, so it's just interesting to see what the responses are. And as I expected, nobody's in agreement on these three topics, right? It's still a very personal matter. So to take Mike's question, this goes back 20 years for me when I first began my Egyptian research, which then had to move into really the study of ancient worlds. I was lucky enough, like I say, to meet this Korean monk. I met some native Indian medicine men who let me spend time with them. And they pushed me into a lot of practice, very detailed practice. And one of the key practices was to test reality. I call this a table, I call this a chair, I call this the floor. How do I know that's what's really here? How am I perceiving the world, and how do I know my perception is correct? So I spent a couple of years, what you might call testing reality. And in the course of 2 years, found out in a very challenging way that reality is not so real. It's not solid. It's anything. It's very malleable, and in fact, it's linked to what we think. Actually, the fact that I think that there's a reality here makes it happen. And so some people get these experiences through various drugs, I guess. I mean, I've stayed away from the drug experience my entire life, pretty much. I've just stayed away from all of it. So all of my ways of testing reality have been straight exercises with the body and the mind. So I already was coming from this perception of like reality's not so true, or it's not as real and solid as I think. And I mean, I can talk about various things that actually happened that proved that to me. But I didn't get an answer as to what reality is. I don't know what reality is or how many. I got to see that you might call layers of reality. That there's one we sort of tend to spend our time on. The one that, there's a Mike, there's a James, there's a Joe, there's a me. We're talking on here. We think this is the reality because it's kind of standard. But it's not always here. Reality can change pretty quickly. And usually when it does, the average person when they get a glitch in the matrix, they just write it off very quickly. Oh, I was tired. This was going on. That can't be. I was hallucinating. I was seeing. But when you're really aware, when you're truly aware of what's going on, you don't miss these things. So you've got that first layer of, okay, so reality is not as real as I had ever thought it was. But when Mike asks about a simulation, the simulation idea is much more, and this takes us into the Plato's cave stuff. And I'll let Mike and you guys just reframe the question. But it'll actually take you into Plato's cave and the story of Plato's cave, and to asking, how real not only is reality, but how real is you? That's the great spirit. It's what was his name? Gary Harman. Gary Harman wrote like a one sentence thing that's one of the greatest things I think ever written. He said, if you treat, how did you say it? If you treat reality as an illusion, but don't treat yourself equally in that illusion, you've made the classic spiritual mistake.
Give us an email at ourbigdumbmouth@gmail.com. Check out obdmpod.com for all the social media and donation links. Be a part of the magic.